Thank you very much indeed. Yes, it's a challenging task to speak on such a topic just before lunch. And I should say a little background to the story. When Mukesh asked me to give a luncheon address, I actually hesitated between two topics that are close to my heart, one being issues surrounding the application of the mutual agreement procedure and tax treaty arbitration in practice, and beneficial ownership. And it turns out that in the meantime, the Swiss Federal Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment regarding beneficial ownership, and therefore my heart went to beneficial ownership. So this is basically why there have been changes, last-minute changes to the program. I see that Mukesh is sitting here next to me, so I do hope that he will interrupt me and that we will be having an interactive discussion. I understand I have around 40 minutes, not more, because we have to go to lunch. So I try to be efficient and entertaining. Yes, so first of all, a few remarks on beneficial ownership in tax treaty law. And it's interesting because if you contrast this with the discussion we just had from a policy perspective on Article XX and the future of the international tax architecture, one might say that I'm here diving into a more needy, greedy area of tax treaty law, but nonetheless an important one for those of you who are involved in tax treaty disputes. Beneficial ownership has been for a while one of the most debated topics in international taxation, and then things calmed down, and then we were under the impression that the topic had been completely exhausted and did not deserve much more consideration. But then we had the famous judgments of the European Court of Justice in these so-called Danish cases, which blended the beneficial ownership limitation with the prohibition of abuse. That triggered in practice in Europe a number of, I would say, aggressive tax audits in several EU member states regarding the application of possible beneficial ownership situations in conduit situations in many European countries. And then what we're witnessing as well is that a number of decisions are currently emerging, both in common law and civil law jurisdictions. We just had one in France. There are a couple of ones in Canada, in particular the Hosky case, which is pending before the Federal Court of Appeal in Canada. So a number of issues surrounding the application of beneficial ownership. And last but not least, we had a landmark judgment on the 3rd of October of this year regarding the application of the term, which was a published judgment, a landmark judgment, which clarified a number of unsettled issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first try to contextualize the discussion, then look at the evolution, because I think it's important to trace back the evolution, then dwell on this landmark judgment, and then follow up on what we have discussed yesterday, is basically look at how conduit situations will be approached in the context of post-BEPS treaties, in particular the interaction between the beneficial ownership limitation and the principal purpose test. And I intend to do this in not more than 40 minutes because we have to go to lunch. Just to contextualize a bit, if you take the OECD Model Tax Convention as it stands today, the beneficial ownership limitation comes up at a very specific point in time of the operation of the treaty, and that is after you have determined who is the treaty resident, after you have applied the so-called personal attribution of income requirement in the distributive rules, namely at the point in time at which you have determined to whom the income is paid to or who is deriving the income, then you look at whether the recipient is the beneficial owner. And then you go to the principal purpose test. And this will be the last part of my presentation. What will be the interaction in conduit situations between beneficial ownership and the principal purpose test? Now, if you look at the evolution of the text of the OECD Model Tax Convention, as it has evolved, as you know, the beneficial ownership limitation was first introduced in the 1977 OECD Model Tax Convention. The evolution of the text of the beneficial ownership limitation, to which I will come in a minute, has essentially focused on the issue which I have tried to illustrate in this diagram, which is the case in which you have an intermediary company deriving dividends, interest, and royalties, and we assume that that company is now not regarded as the beneficial owner. The question, therefore, is whether you can apply directly the treaty between the state of source and the state of the ultimate beneficial owner, or of the beneficial owner. In other words, do you have a detrimental effect because the recipient and the beneficial owner are not the same person? This is an issue which came up also in the Danish cases. It is often coming up, I should say, in tax audits. Very difficult also sometimes to convince the tax authorities that they have to look through and apply the other treaty. So it is a relevant question. And there, the text of the OECD model has been clarified twice. I've basically mentioned here the evolution. So you have the initial language of the 1977 OECD commentary, which you have on your left-hand side, essentially creates a tension between recipient and beneficial owner. Now, the 1995 version of the OECD model essentially tries to ease that tension by making a first change, but the matter still remains controversial. And then finally, when you compare the 1977 and the 2014 OECD model, you see that in the 2014 OECD model tax convention, the question was ultimately addressed. And how was it addressed? Well, if you look at paragraph 2 on the right-hand side of the slides, paragraph 2 of Article 10.2, you see, it's a small detail, you see that the term such has been eliminated, and that basically allows for an autonomous application of Article 10.2, and therefore this allows for a disconnection between, on the one hand, the recipient of the income and the beneficial owner. And then coming back to my earlier slides, this essentially means that you may apply autonomously the treaty between state S and R2 in my example, even if you have a disconnect between the beneficial owner and the recipient. And that is an important question in practice when the conduit entity is not regarded as the beneficial owner. Can you apply the other treaty? The approach was confirmed by the French Conseil d'État in the so-called Planet case, quite an important judgment, and in other judgment as well. But I should say in audits, it is a relevant issue and it's not always accepted. Now, so that was so much for the text. What is more interesting is the evolution of the commentaries, with which I'm sure you are all familiar, so I will just try to discuss this rather quickly, but just to remind you, in 1977 we had a very short commentary referring to intermediaries such as an agent or nominee. The devil is the detail. The question was whether such as was exhaustive or whether it could include other forms of intermediaries, namely conduit entities. And in that case, what were the features of these conduit entities? At that time, we did not have the principal purpose test. At that time, the question of the application, to remind you, Philip Baker mentioned it yesterday, the question of the application of domestic anti-avoidance rules to tax treaties was extremely controversial. The 1977 commentary was very conservative on that front, not allowing the application of these rules, and also the matter was later on controversial, at least until the 2003 commentary of the OECD. Therefore, at that time, beneficial ownership was the only hope to deal with some sort of abuse, namely the abuse involving conduit entities. What is interesting is that the term really got traction as an anti-avoidance rule in the 2003 commentary, further to the Conduit report, where it was essentially, in fact, construed from a purposive perspective. You see that in the language, should be construed in light of the object and purpose of the term, including the prevention of tax avoidance, and then you have an express reference to the Conduit report. But the question remained at that point in time, what is a conduit company?